The air inside the chamber was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that holds its breath before a storm. Cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking like restless eyes, capturing every flicker of emotion, every shift in posture. Rows of journalists sat ready, pens poised, their faces half hidden behind screens. What was supposed to be a procedural ethics hearing had turned into the most anticipated political spectacle of the year. At the center sat Judge Clarence Thomas, his black robe folded neatly over his lap, his expression unreadable but rigid. Decades on the nation's highest court had taught him how to look calm under fire, yet today, even the marble pillars of the room seemed to lean closer, waiting. Behind him, aides whispered and shuffled papers, their movements small but uneasy. Then she entered. Representative Jasmine Crockett moved with a kind of deliberate calm that didn't need fanfare. She wasn't here to grandstand, she was here to expose. Her bright blazer caught the reflection of the overhead lights, sharp, confident, and unafraid. Each step echoed on the polished floor, a slow rhythm of certainty. The audience followed her with their eyes, some with admiration, others with quiet apprehension. Everyone knew she had come prepared. This wasn't the first time Crockett had stood before powerful men, but this was different. The stakes were national. Allegations of ethics violations, undisclosed gifts, and hidden political influence had drawn Clarence Thomas into the public spotlight. What began as whispers in legal circles had grown into a question of trust. Could a Supreme Court justice remain impartial when money and politics crept too close to his chambers? Crockett took her seat at the panel's front, arranging her notes, though she barely looked at them. Her eyes stayed fixed on Thomas. The silence deepened as the chair recognized her for questioning. "Representative Crockett, you may proceed." She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." Her voice was steady, not raised, not forced, just strong enough to fill the room. "Judge Thomas," she began, "you've served this country for over 3 decades. You've interpreted the Constitution, defined justice, and influenced generations. But today isn't about your rulings. It's about your integrity." The words landed like slow thunder. A few heads turned. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his hands, clasped neatly on the table, tightened slightly. Crockett leaned forward. "In recent months, multiple reports have surfaced linking you to undisclosed gifts and travel accommodations from wealthy political donors. Some of these individuals have had direct interests in cases before the court. Would you agree, Judge Thomas, that such relationships, if proven, undermine the very trust the people place in our judiciary?" The question was polite, procedural even, but the undertone was sharp. Thomas adjusted his microphone, his deep voice filling the chamber. "I understand the concern, Representative," he said slowly, "but I have always conducted myself within the boundaries of the law. These allegations," Crockett raised a hand lightly, not to interrupt but to anchor the moment. "With respect, Judge Thomas, the issue isn't lawfulness, it's honesty." The word honesty hit the room like a gavel. Behind her, cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Thomas hesitated. He had been questioned many times before, but something about her tone, the calm precision, felt different. There was no performance in her voice. It carried the weight of accountability. The chairman shifted uneasily. He knew the political temperature in that room. Crockett was not here to score points. She was dismantling a wall that had stood for years, a wall built on silence and prestige. "Judge Thomas," Crockett continued, her tone measured, "over the years, you've spoken about fairness and faith. You've told young Americans to trust the system. But can a system be trusted if its highest judges live above the rules that bind the rest of us?" He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. The question hung there, heavy, unanswerable, dangerous. For a moment, even the air felt heavier. The audience sensed it, a turning point. Crockett had not accused, she had merely asked, yet in that single question, she had cornered the truth without raising her voice. Thomas shifted, drawing in a slow breath. "Representative Crockett, I am a man of integrity. My record speaks for itself." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then let's talk about that record." A flicker of tension passed through the room. She flipped through her folder, pulling a highlighted document free. "In 2019 you were reported to have accepted luxury travel accommodations valued at over $500,000. These trips were not disclosed on your financial statements. When questioned, your office cited a misunderstanding of reporting requirements. Tell me, Judge, does the law make room for misunderstanding when it comes to the truth?" There was no anger in her tone, only quiet disappointment. the kind that digs deeper than outrage ever could. Thomas shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I've always followed the guidance given by the ethics office," he replied carefully. "If errors occurred, they were administrative, not intentional." Crockett nodded slowly. "And yet, the pattern continued for years." Her words dropped like pebbles into a still pond, each one rippling wider than the last. Members of the audience whispered among themselves. Cameras panned closer to Thomas's face, beads of sweat barely visible under the lights. He looked calm, but his silence betrayed the pressure building behind that composure. Crockett placed her papers aside. "Judge Thomas, you once said, and I quote, 'The greatest threat to justice is the perception that it serves only the powerful.'" She paused. "Do you still believe that?" Thomas's eyes flickered. "Yes, I do." "Then," she said softly, "what happens when you become that perception?" The room froze. No one spoke, not even the chairman. The question wasn't just legal, it was moral. It reached beyond documents and statements, beyond politics, straight into the soul of justice itself. Thomas leaned back, his hands now folded tight, as if bracing against the weight of that question. Outside the chamber, the world watched through screens. Hashtags were already spreading across social media: Crockett v. Thomas, fait truth en trial, fait judicial ethics. People from every political side tuned in, some to defend, others to witness what they already suspected. Inside, the silence lingered long enough to make time itself uncomfortable. Crockett didn't speak again right away. She let the tension do the talking. It was a silence that forced reflection, not just for Thomas, but for every person watching who had ever believed justice was untouchable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost reflective. "This hearing isn't about your past, Judge Thomas. It's about the future. About whether our courts can still belong to the people, not the powerful. And sometimes, one honest answer can do more to restore faith than 1,000 defenses." Thomas said nothing. His eyes lowered for the first time that morning. The chairman cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Your time is nearly up, Representative Crockett." Crockett nodded. "I only have one more question," she said, closing her folder. "And it's the simplest one you'll hear today." She leaned forward, voice steady, eyes locked on his. "Who do you really serve? The people? Or the power that protects you?" The chamber erupted, whispers, gasps, even the clicking of cameras turned frantic. The chairman's gavel came down sharply, calling for order, but the moment had already escaped into history. Thomas didn't answer, he couldn't. His silence said enough. As the hearing recessed, Crockett gathered her papers calmly and rose. Her face was unreadable, but her steps carried quiet conviction. She didn't look for applause. She didn't need it. The question she'd asked would echo far beyond that marble room. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, distant but rising, as if the world itself had heard her. The storm had begun. The echo of her words still lingered in the air long after the gavel struck. "Who do you really serve? The people, or the power that protects you?" It was more than a question. It was a verdict disguised as inquiry. And for the first time in decades, Justice Clarence Thomas had no answer. The crowd had been dismissed for recess, yet the energy of that moment refused to die. In the hallway outside the chamber, cameras swarmed, microphones stretched forward, and a storm of questions flooded the air. But all anyone really wanted to know was what Thomas would say when he returned. Inside a quiet holding room, Thomas sat surrounded by aides and legal counsel. The polished table between them reflected his stillness, unmoving, distant, thoughtful. He had faced difficult hearings before, but never like this. Never with the entire country waiting for a single response. "Judge," one aide whispered, "you don't have to dignify her theatrics with an answer. Stick to your statement. You've done nothing wrong." But Thomas didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the crowd of protesters gathering outside the Capitol steps. Their signs read on AOVA ETS FAR AL, US. He'd seen protests before, but something about this felt different. Not angry, just disappointed. Disappointment cut deeper than outrage. In another room, Representative Jasmine Crockett stood before a cluster of journalists. Her tone remained measured, never triumphant. "This isn't about partisanship," she said evenly. "This is about transparency. The American people deserve to know that justice cannot be bought, borrowed, or bartered." Her voice carried calm conviction. There was no victory in her posture, only resolve. Reporters pressed for sound bites, but Crockett didn't feed the frenzy. She had said what needed to be said, and the silence from Thomas had done the rest. When the hearing resumed, the crowd had grown larger. The cameras were closer. The chairman's gavel sounded again, restoring a tense semblance of order. Thomas returned to his seat, this time with the weight of the nation's attention pressing down like a physical force. His robe seemed heavier now, his composure slightly cracked. Crockett was back in her chair, calm as ever. The two locked eyes once more, not as adversaries, but as two forces of truth colliding from opposite worlds. The chairman cleared his throat. Judge Thomas, before we proceed, you have the opportunity to respond to the representative's final question. Thomas adjusted his microphone. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. He began slowly. Representative Crockett, I have served this country faithfully for over 30 years. I serve the Constitution, not politics. I do not answer to power. I answer to principle. A few murmurs of approval rippled through his allies, but Crockett did not move, did not react. She simply listened, which somehow made her presence even more powerful. Thomas continued, I acknowledge that perception matters, and if mistakes were made in disclosure, they were administrative, not ethical. The law. Crockett's soft voice cut in, respectful but firm. Judge Thomas, perception is the foundation of ethics. The people don't just expect the law to be followed, they expect those who interpret it to embody it. A hush followed. Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was corrective. It felt less like an attack and more like a mirror being held up to a man who no longer recognized his own reflection. Thomas's jaw tightened. With respect, Representative, I do not accept the notion that a justice's reputation should be determined by headlines. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Neither do I, Judge. But perhaps it should be determined by actions. The words landed quietly, but they struck hard. Thomas exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. She continued, voice steady. The people are not asking for perfection, Judge Thomas. They are asking for truth. They want to know that the scales of justice aren't tilted by influence. That every decision, yours included, comes from law, not loyalty. Thomas stared down at the desk. His silence stretched on so long that even the cameraman stopped shifting in place. Every second that passed became heavier than the last. In the gallery, whispers began to build like distant thunder. Members of Congress exchanged glances. Some were astonished by Crockett's composure. Others were unnerved by how effectively she'd dismantled decades of untouchable authority without raising her voice. This wasn't an argument. It was exposure through restraint. One senator leaned toward another and whispered, she's not just questioning him, she's making him question himself. Thomas finally spoke again, his tone quieter, less certain. You speak of loyalty, Representative. My loyalty has always been to the law. Crockett nodded. Then let's talk about that loyalty. She lifted a printed record from her folder. In several recent cases involving political donors and corporate interests, your votes aligned with the positions of those who have reportedly provided you with undisclosed gifts. The public might see that as a conflict of interest. Shouldn't a justice, above all others, avoid even the appearance of impropriety? Thomas didn't immediately respond. His lips parted slightly, but no words followed. Crockett didn't press further. She let the silence carry her point again. In politics, silence is often guilt's shadow. Finally, Thomas spoke, not with confidence but with fatigue. Representative, if the court is to function, it cannot bend to public opinion. The rule of law must stand apart from perception. Her answer came softly. And yet, Judge, public trust is the rule of law's foundation. When the people lose faith in the fairness of the court, its rulings lose meaning. Her words echoed like a truth that had long been waiting to be spoken aloud. Even the chairman seemed momentarily struck. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the high windows of the hearing room. Thunder rolled a moment later, distant yet perfectly timed. It felt as though the storm outside had synchronized with the one inside. The tension had become almost tangible. A voice from the back called out, "Answer her question." Security moved swiftly to quiet the outburst, but the damage was done. The sentiment had found its way into the air. Crockett remained poised, not even glancing at the commotion. She didn't need to. She had already captured the attention of millions beyond those walls. On social media, her words were being replayed, dissected, celebrated. Clips of her final question, "Who do you really serve?" had already gone viral. The people weren't just watching a hearing anymore, they were witnessing a reckoning. Inside, the chairman tried to move forward. Let's maintain decorum, please. Representative Crockett, do you have further questions? She closed her folder. Not questions, Mr. Chairman. Just a reminder. Her eyes turned once more to Thomas. The integrity of the court is not protected by silence. It's protected by accountability. Every generation must decide whether justice belongs to the people or to the privileged. That decision begins right here. Then she leaned back, her point made. The room remained silent again, but this time the silence didn't belong to Thomas, it belonged to her. Even those who opposed her politically couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply asked, and that had been enough to shake one of the most powerful men in the nation. As the chairman adjourned for the day, the crowd began to move, buzzing with disbelief. Reporters rushed toward the exit, eager to broadcast the day's confrontation. Pundits would soon debate it. Commentators would pick apart every word. But the truth was simple. A single question had cut through decades of political armor. Outside, the storm had finally broken. Rain poured over the marble steps, streaking across the flags and the cameras and the faces of protesters who refused to leave. Yet through the noise, a chant began to rise, faint at first but growing stronger.
Answer the question!
Answer the question! Inside his car, Judge Clarence Thomas sat in silence, watching the droplets race down the glass. His driver asked if he wanted to respond to the press. Thomas didn't answer. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett walked through the corridors surrounded by flashing lights and shouted questions. She didn't slow. She didn't gloat. She simply whispered to an aide beside her, "The truth always trembles before it speaks." And as she stepped out into the rain, the cameras caught her face, calm, unwavering, unafraid. The storm outside had met the storm within, and neither was backing down. The next morning, the country awoke not to headlines, but to history. Every major network led with the same clip: Jasmine Crockett's final question and Clarence Thomas's silence. Over and over again, the moment replayed. A still courtroom, a calm voice, and a question that seemed to pierce through marble and tradition alike. Who do you really serve? The people, or the power that protects you? By dawn it had become more than a quote. It was a question echoing across living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms nationwide. Commentators called it the shot that cracked the robe. Inside the Capitol, whispers filled every corridor. The hearing that was once expected to fade into bureaucracy had ignited a political wildfire. Lawmakers walked briskly through the hallways, dodging reporters who shouted questions like thrown stones. Will there be a formal ethics probe? Does this put pressure on the Supreme Court to adopt accountability standards? Has Justice Thomas responded to Representative Crockett's statement? Oh, no answers came. Only evasive smiles and quiet tension. Meanwhile, at her office, Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers she barely needed to read. Her team buzzed with energy, phones ringing, messages pouring in, interviews requested by every network in the country. Yet she wasn't celebrating. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the muted television across the room. On screen, a panel of commentators debated her performance. She went too far, one argued. It was disrespectful to a sitting justice. Another countered, no, she did what Congress has been too afraid to do for decades: demand accountability. Crockett turned down the volume. She wasn't interested in punditry. She was thinking about the moment Thomas looked down, the split second when the shield of confidence cracked. It hadn't been victory she felt then. It was validation, the truth struggling to surface after years buried beneath the weight of titles and robes. In contrast, the atmosphere inside the Supreme Court building was tense and brittle. Clerks spoke in hushed voices. Doors that once stood open were now shut. The justices moved like shadows down marble halls, avoiding eye contact with reporters camped at every exit. Justice Thomas remained mostly unseen. Behind his office door, the silence was heavy. He sat at his desk, surrounded by decades of legal texts, yet today none of them offered clarity. His reflection stared back at him from a framed photo of his early years. Young, determined, full of conviction. He remembered those days, when his robe symbolized justice, not controversy. He exhaled long and slow. For the first time he wondered if silence had been his greatest mistake. That afternoon, a statement appeared, short, careful, and cold. Justice Clarence Thomas maintains his record of integrity and adherence to the rule of law. Allegations of impropriety are politically motivated and lack factual basis. But the statement did nothing to calm the storm. If anything, it fueled it. Commentators called it defensive. Critics called it tone-deaf. Supporters called it necessary. And through it all, one phrase continued to trend worldwide: at the question a couldn't answer. Later that evening, in a live interview, Crockett finally spoke. Standing before a sea of microphones, she wore the same composure she had in the hearing. "I wasn't attacking a justice," she said. "I was defending justice itself. Our system only works when the people believe in it. When truth becomes selective, democracy becomes silent, and silence," she paused, "is what we heard that day." Her words spread like wildfire. Clips of the interview flooded social media. Protesters outside the Capitol began chanting her name. For some, she became a symbol of courage, for others, a spark of controversy. But no one could ignore her now. Inside Congress, conversations shifted. What had once been whispered suddenly became legislation in motion. Proposals for a Judicial Ethics and Transparency Act, demands for mandatory financial disclosures, and debates about whether lifetime appointments had gone unchecked for too long. Behind closed doors, senior lawmakers discussed optics. One senator muttered, "She's turned public opinion against the bench. That's not good for anyone." Another replied quietly, "Or maybe it's finally good for everyone." Meanwhile, inside his Virginia home, Thomas sat in his study, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His wife, Ginny Thomas, hovered nearby, reading from her phone. "They're tearing you apart online," she said softly. "You should release another statement. Something stronger." Thomas shook his head. "Strength isn't what they want," he muttered. "They want remorse." He looked toward the window, at the distant lights of Washington flickering in the night. For the first time in years, the fortress of authority around him felt fragile. Crockett's words had done something no ruling or hearing ever had. They had made him human in the public eye, fallible and vulnerable. He rose from his chair and whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, maybe she was right to ask. By morning, the story had split the nation. Some called Crockett a hero. Others called her reckless. But everyone called her fearless. On talk shows and podcasts, analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, dissecting every movement. One moment, in particular, captivated audiences. The instant Thomas looked down at the desk, his eyes heavy with something unspoken. Commentators called it the drop, a moment where the mighty seemed to fall inward. In the midst of the frenzy, Crockett received a handwritten letter delivered to her office. It had no name, no return address, only a short message on cream-colored stationery. "For years, I believed power was justice. Thank you for reminding me that truth is greater." A man who once wore the robe. She read it twice, then folded it carefully. She didn't need to know who sent it. The message was enough. Days later, the hearings resumed, this time under tighter security and even higher viewership. The crowd overflowed into hallways. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder, live streaming every second. When Thomas entered, there was no applause, no outrage, just silence, the kind of silence that follows revelation. Crockett sat poised once more, her hands folded neatly on the desk before her. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply nodded as Thomas took his seat. This time, it was he who broke the silence first. "Representative Crockett," he said quietly, "I owe the people an answer." Her brows lifted slightly, not in triumph, but in respect. Thomas continued, "I've served the law my entire life, but perhaps I forgot that the law serves people. If my actions, or my omissions, have caused doubt, then I must face that truth, however uncomfortable it may be." Gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was an admission of humanity. Crockett responded softly, "Acknowledgement is where reform begins." Thomas nodded. "And silence is where it ends." The moment wasn't explosive, but it was seismic. Something had shifted, not in law, but in conscience. For the first time, the nation saw accountability from a seat once thought untouchable. Outside, the storm clouds that had hovered for days began to break. Sunlight streaked through the gray, falling across the Capitol steps where protesters still stood. Some wept, others clapped, but all of them felt something rare: hope. That night, as Crockett walked to her car, a reporter called out,
Representative!
"Do you think today changed anything?" She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Change isn't what happens in the room," she said. "It's what happens in the hearts of those who watched." Then she turned and walked into the fading light, her figure framed by the setting sun, the crowd chanting softly behind her name. For the first time in years, the nation wasn't just talking about power, it was talking about principle. And in that shift, subtle, profound, irreversible, the cracks in the robe became a mirror for the whole country. Washington had not seen calm in weeks. The storm that began with one question had turned into a nationwide movement. Outside the Supreme Court, the air buzzed with chants, cameras, and conviction. The marble steps, once symbols of stillness and respect, were now the front lines of a moral reckoning. From dawn until dusk, crowds gathered. Some carried signs reading, "Accountability for all," others, "No justice without ethics." Reporters described it as a modern echo of Watergate, not about crime, but about credibility. Every conversation in Washington circled back to one moment: Jasmine Crockett's question and Clarence Thomas's silence. It wasn't just political anymore. It was personal to the American people. Inside the Capitol, meetings stretched long into the night. The words judicial ethics appeared on documents, agendas, and late-night news crawlers. A bipartisan bill, the Supreme Transparency and Accountability Act, began circulating through committees. The idea that justices should disclose gifts, recuse themselves from conflicts, and face oversight was no longer a fringe proposal. It was now a national demand. But behind closed doors, the pushback was fierce. A senior senator, his voice low and sharp, said, "You're creating a dangerous precedent. The judiciary must remain independent." Another replied quietly, "Independence isn't immunity." The room fell silent, because no one could argue that truth. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had become an unexpected household name. Late-night hosts quoted her line, activists wore shirts with her words, "Who do you really serve?" Her speeches filled stadiums now. She didn't ask for fame, but truth had a way of shining even when one tried to stay in shadow. Yet, fame was a double-edged blade. With admiration came attacks, editorials calling her divisive, political ads painting her as anti-institution. She ignored them. Her focus stayed on the cause. Late one evening, as she prepared for another televised interview, her assistant entered with a worried look. "They're saying Justice Thomas's allies are calling for an inquiry into you now," he said. Crockett smiled faintly, adjusting the mic on her blazer. "If standing for accountability makes me their target," she said, "then I know I'm in the right fight." Across town, inside his chambers, Justice Clarence Thomas faced a different kind of noise, the sound of his own conscience. The past weeks had stripped away the armor of silence. The robe that once felt like protection now weighed on him like guilt. He looked through letters that had arrived from across the country. Some scolded him. Others pleaded with him to clear the air. But one letter stopped him cold. It was written by a high school civics teacher in Ohio. "Every year, I tell my students that the Supreme Court stands for truth. Please, Your Honor, don't make me a liar." He read it twice, and when he looked up, his reflection in the darkened window seemed older, smaller, mortal. He whispered, "Maybe I've been standing for the law so long I forgot to stand for the people." Back in Congress, the hearing resumed for the final phase. The world was watching again. Thomas appeared. But this time, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't the stern composure of a justice defending his name. It was the quiet look of a man reckoning with himself. Crockett sat across from him, papers in front of her, but her hands rested calmly on the table. She didn't need to hold anything now. The truth had already found its voice. The chairman spoke first. "We'll reconvene to discuss recommendations for judicial ethics reform." "Justice Thomas, you've requested the floor." Thomas adjusted his microphone. His voice was quieter than usual, but clearer. "I've spent my life interpreting law," he said, believing it was enough to follow its letter. But Representative Crockett reminded me, and the nation, that the spirit of law is trust. Without it, the Constitution is paper. And perhaps, in silence, I've allowed that trust to fray. The room went still. Crockett watched him, not as an adversary, but as a witness to change. Thomas continued, "I will comply with any reform Congress deems necessary. No justice should live above the same accountability that binds the nation we serve." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the chairman looked stunned. A justice had just endorsed oversight, something unthinkable weeks earlier. Crockett spoke softly. "The people will remember that, Judge," he nodded. "And I will remember your question." Outside the courtroom, the announcement spread faster than wildfire. Commentators called it historic, pundits called it humbling, citizens called it hopeful. For once, the headlines didn't scream division, they whispered reform. Yet, not everyone celebrated. Behind the scenes, a darker storm brewed, the machinery of politics grinding in resentment. Certain figures within the establishment saw Crockett not as a reformer but as a threat. "She's dangerous," muttered one strategist in a closed-door meeting. "She's rewriting the power dynamic. If people start believing judges can be questioned, politicians will be next." Another replied, "They already are." Attempts to discredit her began, leaked rumors, manipulated clips, old campaign misquotes twisted into controversy. But each time they struck, the public only rallied harder. Her honesty had become her shield. And when journalists asked her about the attacks, she replied simply, "When you shake power, power shakes back." Weeks passed. Thomas grew quieter in public, but in private, he began drafting an unprecedented proposal. A call for voluntary ethics standards for all sitting justices. He sent a copy to the Chief Justice with a handwritten note. "It's time the court reflects the people it serves." The proposal leaked within hours. And though some dismissed it as symbolic, it marked something deeper. A change in tone. A shift from arrogance to acknowledgement. For the first time in decades, people felt they were being heard by the highest court in the land. In an interview later that month, Crockett was asked what drove her to speak so boldly that day. She smiled faintly. "It wasn't boldness," she said. "It was duty. Sometimes silence in power becomes louder than words. I just decided to interrupt the silence." Her voice carried quiet fire, the kind that burns slow but leaves a mark that never fades. But change never comes without resistance. As reforms gained traction, the political divide deepened. Commentators warned of a constitutional clash. Some called Crockett's movement a rebellion against tradition. Others called it the rebirth of democracy. Through it all, she kept her focus on one principle: truth must never fear power. She received letters from law students, young activists, and even judges, thanking her for making integrity speak again. One note stood out: "You didn't just question a man. You reminded us what justice should feel like." Then, one evening, as the Capitol lights glowed across the river, Crockett stood on a small balcony overlooking the city. The air was calm now. No chants, no cameras, just the hum of distant life. Her aide approached with a folder. "The final vote's tomorrow," he said. "The bill has enough support to pass." Crockett nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's not about passing laws," she murmured. "It's about passing truth forward." Across the city, in his study, Clarence Thomas sat once more beneath the warm glow of a desk lamp. On his desk rested a copy of the proposed ethics bill. He smiled faintly, tired, reflective. He took out a pen and underlined one line from the preamble: "Justice must not only be fair, it must be seen to be fair." Then he whispered into the quiet room, "Finally, it will be." The unraveling wasn't chaos, it was clarity. The old threads of silence, privilege, and untouchable power had finally begun to come undone. And in their place, new ones were being woven: transparency, truth, and the courage to question. History would remember this not as the fall of a justice, but as the moment justice began to stand taller. Because sometimes unraveling isn't destruction, it's rebirth. The morning broke over Washington with an almost unnatural stillness. A kind of calm that comes when the city knows history is about to be written. The Capitol dome gleamed like a silent witness to the nation's conscience. Every corridor, every lobby, every hallway echoed with a single question: what happens next? The vote on the Supreme Transparency and Accountability Act was just hours away. It wasn't just a piece of legislation. It was a declaration that no one, not even the highest judges in the land, could live above the truth. News outlets counted down like it was a national election. Outside, crowds gathered, waving flags and signs bearing Jasmine Crockett's now iconic quote: "Who do you really serve?" A question that had started as a challenge was now a rallying cry. Inside the building, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in her office. Papers were stacked neatly beside her, untouched. The TV played muted coverage of the growing crowd, but her attention was elsewhere. She stared out the window, her reflection framed against the Capitol dome. For weeks, she had carried the weight of this movement. But now, as the moment drew near, she felt something unexpected: peace. Not victory, not pride, just peace. Because she knew that what began as confrontation had become transformation. Her aide entered the room, slightly breathless. "It's time," he said. Crockett nodded, straightened her jacket, and whispered, "Then let's finish what truth started." The chamber filled fast. Senators, representatives, reporters, and the silent presence of history itself. Even members who rarely agreed on anything now sat shoulder to shoulder, drawn together by the magnitude of the day. On the side gallery sat a quiet figure, Justice Clarence Thomas, dressed not in his robe, but in a simple gray suit. His face was calm, unreadable, yet his eyes betrayed a man carrying the weight of reflection. As the session began, the speaker's voice rang out: Today, the House convenes for a vote on the Supreme Transparency and Accountability Act, a measure to restore trust, fairness, and faith in the judicial branch. Cameras clicked, pens scratched. The world leaned in. Crockett rose from her seat. Her voice, steady yet warm, filled the hall. Mr. Speaker, colleagues, and citizens, today isn't about party or politics. It's about principle. It's about ensuring that those who interpret the law also live by its light. The Supreme Court is not a throne. It is a trust, and trust, once broken, must be rebuilt, not with words but with accountability. She paused. I didn't set out to challenge a justice. I set out to remind us all that justice itself must never be challenged by secrecy. Across the room, Thomas lowered his head slightly, not in shame but in acknowledgement. Her words struck something deeper than defiance. They touched the human beneath the title. Crockett continued, her tone rising with conviction. This bill is not revenge, it is renewal. Because when the people begin to doubt their courts, democracy begins to crack. And we cannot build a future on cracks, only on courage. Her final words echoed through the chamber. Let the law serve the people again, and let truth never need permission to speak. When she sat down, silence followed, not awkward, not hesitant, but reverent. The kind of silence that comes when truth has already said everything. The speaker called the vote. Names echoed one by one through the chamber, each word a note in the unfolding symphony of history. Yes. No. Yes. Yes. The tally grew on the digital board, the numbers shifting slowly, agonizingly as the entire nation watched in real time. When the final count flashed across the screen, a hush swept the room. Then came the words everyone had been waiting for, the bill passes. The room erupted, applause, relief, disbelief, all blending into a chorus of vindication. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed. Somewhere in the back, a young intern began to cry. Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaling the storm that had lived inside her for months. It was done. Justice had not fallen, it had evolved. Outside, the crowd roared as the news broke. People hugged strangers, cheered through tears, waved flags, and chanted her name. For the first time in years, the word justice felt alive again. Not cold, not distant, but human. In the distance, the Supreme Court's steps stood quiet under the afternoon sun. And there, standing at the top, Clarence Thomas watched the crowd from afar. He was not bitter, he was not broken. He was, perhaps for the first time in a long while, honest with himself. A journalist approached gently, microphone in hand. Justice Thomas, how do you feel seeing this moment unfold? He looked out at the cheering crowd and said softly, accountability doesn't destroy faith, it restores it. I learned that too late, but I'm grateful I learned it at all. Then he turned and walked back inside the court, disappearing into its marble halls. Not as the man who lost an argument, but as one who found humility. That evening, as the city glowed under the night sky, Crockett appeared on national television. The interviewer leaned forward. Representative Crockett, how does it feel to have changed history? She smiled faintly. I didn't change history, she said. The people did. I just asked a question that needed to be heard. The interviewer pressed on. And what do you hope comes next? Crockett looked straight into the camera. Not as a politician, but as a citizen. I hope we remember that power is not a right, and it's a responsibility. And questioning it isn't rebellion, it's democracy. Weeks later, life in Washington returned to its usual rhythm. Debates, votes, noise. But something had shifted quietly beneath it all. The new ethics standards began taking shape: mandatory financial disclosures, recusal requirements, and a public transparency database for judicial conduct. Law schools began teaching the Crockett question as a landmark in civic accountability. Students studied it not as a scandal, but as a symbol of courage, proof that even the most powerful can be questioned by the principled. One professor summed it up best: history doesn't remember who had the gavel. It remembers who had the courage to speak when it mattered. On the anniversary of the hearing, Jasmine Crockett visited her hometown in Texas. She stood before a crowd of young students at a local community center. The same place where she once gave her first public speech years ago. She looked at the bright, curious faces and said, one day you'll face a room full of people who tell you to stay quiet, that power can't be challenged, that questions cause trouble. But when that day comes, remember silence protects power. Questions protect truth. Applause filled the hall, but she only smiled humbly, as if she knew the journey was bigger than her. Later that night, she stood alone beneath the stars, phone in hand. A message notification appeared. It was from an unknown number. The text read simply, "You were right to ask. CT." She stared at it for a long time, then placed the phone back in her pocket and whispered to the night. It was never about being right. It was about being heard. In the months that followed, both their names would be etched differently into history books. Not as enemies, but as two forces that collided to awaken a sleeping nation. Crockett became the face of modern accountability. Thomas became the symbol of reflection and reform. And together, unknowingly, they redefined what justice could mean in America. Years later, when asked about that fateful day, the day her question stopped a justice mid-sentence, Jasmine Crockett only said this: "I didn't expose a man. I exposed a silence that had lasted too long." And with that, she smiled, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows that truth, once spoken, never dies. Jasmine Crockett exposes Judge Clarence Thomas with one question he couldn't answer live. A story not of scandal but of conscience. A reminder that in the grand courtroom of history, it is not power that delivers justice. It is truth that stands the final witness.